The warning has echoed for decades: challenge the West and perish. Lumumba silence in 67 days. Sankara gunned down in 4 short years. Gaddafi, who dared to dream of a single African currency, killed in cold blood as the world watched. This is the message engraved on Africa's soil: step out of line and pay in blood. And yet, the soil still produces seeds of defiance. From this same land of broken chains rises a young captain, Ibrahim Traoré, who at 34 dared to rewrite the script. In a world where the wealth of Burkina Faso is mined and shipped abroad while its people remain among the poorest, he declared that dignity matters more than permission, that sovereignty is not charity, but destiny. His rise is not just about one nation. It is a tremor that shakes the map, a challenge to centuries of dependence. The question is not whether the West will resist. They already are. But whether this new generation of Africans will endure long enough to harvest freedom. Do not look away. This is not just a headline. It is a turning point. Subscribe and walk with us. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country with soil rich in gold, but fields cracked by poverty, became the stage for one of Africa's most dramatic turns in recent memory. By 2020, the nation was exporting over 60 tons of gold every year, yet its people ranked among the poorest on earth, its Human Development Index standing at 182 out of 189. Life expectancy barely reached 61 years. Only a little more than a third of the people had access to clean water. Wealth flowed north, into the coffers of corporations and foreign capitals, while in the villages, children studied by candlelight and families dug deep into dry wells for survival. This paradox was not an accident. It was the legacy of a system where aid was called partnership, but extraction was the true bargain. French soldiers patrolled the north, ostensibly protecting the people, but in practice guarding mining installations. Foreign advisors filled briefing rooms, deciding strategies for territories whose soil they did not know and whose people they did not answer to. To young officers like Ibrahim Traoré, this was not security, it was dependence dressed in uniform. The crisis of terrorism, which escalated in the mid-2010s, only deepened this reality. In January 2016, when gunmen attacked the Splendid Hotel in Ouagadougou and killed 30 civilians, the message was clear: Burkina Faso was bleeding. Attacks spread from markets to mosques, from schools to clinics. Teachers abandoned classrooms. Health workers fled rural stations. Entire communities became ghost towns. The state seemed absent, and in its place came foreign missions with their own priorities. For Traoré, then a captain in the north, the sight was unbearable. His people trapped between militants on one side and foreign indifference on the other. When Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, elected in 2015, chose to follow the international playbook, accepting aid, implementing reforms dictated abroad, and clinging to French security guarantees, popular frustration swelled. By 2021, protests demanded his resignation. And when Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba seized power in January 2022, many, including Traoré, saw a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this time, the promises of sovereignty and dignity would mean something. But the script repeated itself. Within months, Damiba showed the same dependence. Attending briefings dominated by French officers, maintaining aid deals that tethered Burkina Faso to external interests, failing to stem the tide of violence. To the soldiers at the front lines, it felt like betrayal. To the citizens in displacement camps, it felt like abandonment. And to Ibrahim Traoré, it felt like history mocking his country once again. The breaking point came in late September 2022. At a security meeting, Damiba deferred to French advisors over strategy in Burkinabe territory. For Traoré, that was the moment the mask fell. Changing faces meant nothing if the puppet strings remained the same. That night, he gathered fellow young officers who had lost comrades in battles, fought for interests not their own. Together, they resolved that Burkina Faso's soil could no longer be commanded from abroad. On the morning of 30th September 2022, gunfire shook the capital. By dawn, the world saw a 34-year-old captain on national television declaring the overthrow of Damiba. It was the second coup in 9 months, but it felt entirely different. This was not another officer seizing power to preserve the same order. This was a rupture. This was the youngest head of state on earth, announcing that Burkina Faso would not remain a pawn in someone else's game. For some, it was reckless. For others, it was liberation. Across Ouagadougou, thousands poured into the streets, waving flags, chanting his name, celebrating not just a change of leadership, but the possibility of reclaiming destiny. To them, Traore embodied something larger. The idea that dignity could no longer be postponed, that sovereignty was not a slogan, but a fight worth risking everything for. But coups are only beginnings, not endings. And for Ibrahim Traoré, the real battle was not against Damiba or even against terrorism. It was against the centuries-old system that had kept his people poor while their land was rich. But this was only the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. The coup of September 2022 did not end with a declaration. It ignited a fire. Within weeks, the new leader made decisions that signaled this was no ordinary transfer of power. Instead of traveling to Paris or Washington to seek recognition, Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke first to his people. On national television, his words were simple yet seismic. Burkina Faso would chart its own course, free from the guardianship of others. His boldest move came in December 22. He ordered the departure of French troops who had been stationed in the country for decades. For many Burkinabe, the sight of French convoys leaving Ouagadougou was more than a military adjustment. It was a psychological emancipation. The departure closed a chapter in which foreign soldiers had patrolled their streets and dictated their security. To Traoré, this was a message carved in stone. Africa's security did not require European supervision. Western media reacted swiftly, labeling him rash, reckless, even dangerous. Editorials warned of instability. Analysts questioned whether the young officer knew what he was doing. Yet across the streets of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, the reaction was electric. Crowds celebrated as though a yoke had been lifted. Traoré's defiance became contagious. The symbolism deepened as new partnerships emerged. Russian military trainers began arriving in the capital, offering arms and instruction without the paternal lectures. Chinese companies were invited to bid for infrastructure projects, challenging the monopoly once held by European firms. Iranian experts traveled to rural provinces, advising on agriculture and food processing. Critics in Western capitals called it a pivot to authoritarian allies. Supporters called it pragmatism, a willingness to work with anyone who respected sovereignty rather than dictated terms. This defiance resonated beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta echoed similar rhetoric about dignity and independence. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Tiani questioned uranium deals with France and the presence of American bases. Together, these three leaders began to sketch a new regional order. What began as one coup was now taking shape as a continental conversation. By mid-2023, the cooperation was formalized. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced the alliance of Sahel states, a pact that went beyond military cooperation. They pledged to share intelligence, launch joint operations against militants, and explore economic integration to reduce reliance on former colonial powers. For decades, the Sahel had been described as fragile, fragmented, and dependent. Now, for the first time, leaders were speaking of unity, strength, and dignity. The response from regional institutions was immediate. COWAS, backed by Western governments, threatened sanctions. They warned of diplomatic isolation and economic collapse. But instead of retreating, the alliance accelerated its plans to exit ECOWAS altogether. The message was blunt. If inclusion meant subservience, then exclusion was a price worth paying. This was not just politics. It was theater on the continental stage. In Pan-African conferences, Traore became the centerpiece, drawing standing ovations for lines such as, "We will reclaim our continent's destiny." Young Africans from Dakar to Nairobi shared his speeches online, hailing him as proof that a new generation of leaders could finally break the cycle of deference. Western establishments grew uneasy. European think tanks published reports warning of a contagion effect, fearing that this wave of anti-colonial rhetoric could spread to larger, more strategic nations. American diplomats privately debated containment strategies, while public statements emphasized concerns about democratic backsliding. But every condemnation seemed to fuel his popularity. To many Africans, sanctions, reports, and critical headlines looked like confirmation that Traoré was striking at the heart of a system long designed to keep them in chains. Each criticism became a badge of authenticity. The momentum was undeniable. In less than a year, a 34-year-old captain had not only overthrown a president, but also challenged the architecture of post-colonial control across the Sahel. Supporters began to whisper of him not just as a national leader, but as a continental symbol, the one who dared to say no and mean it. And yet, symbols are fragile. They shine brightly, but also attract the fiercest storms. A lone coup had become a continental movement, but how long could it hold against global pressure? Revolutions may inspire with their slogans, but it is ordinary families who carry the heaviest burdens. In the months following Ibrahim Traoré's dramatic rise, Burkina Faso became both a symbol of hope and a crucible of suffering. The security crisis, already devastating before the coup, deepened as militant groups exploited the power vacuum left by departing French forces. Attacks multiplied. The death toll, which had stood at over 3,600 in 2022, rose to more than 6,000 by 2024. In the countryside, vast stretches of land slipped beyond government control. For families in the north and east, life became an endless cycle of flight and fear. Schools closed, teachers fled, clinics shut their doors, and markets were abandoned. By 2024, more than 2 million Burkinabe, nearly 1 in 10 citizens, had been displaced. Entire villages became camps of the uprooted, where children grew up under canvas shelters and mothers queued for scarce water. Traoré's critics pointed to these numbers as evidence of failure. They argued that expelling foreign troops without a fully prepared domestic alternative was reckless. His supporters countered that no foreign mission had ever truly secured the land, that sovereignty was never going to be painless, and that the cost of dependence was simply being paid in a different currency. Economically, the rupture with France and Western donors unleashed new hardships. Foreign investment dried up, infrastructure projects slowed to a crawl, and youth unemployment remained high. In mining towns, contracts were being renegotiated to secure a greater share for Burkina Faso. Yet the benefits were slow to materialize. Processing facilities to add value to raw gold and agricultural products were announced but not yet operational. The contradiction was stark. A government preaching self-reliance still found itself leaning heavily on gold exports and a handful of cash crops, the very model it had denounced. Meanwhile, new partnerships with Russia, China, and Iran brought their own limitations. Russian military aid arrived, but often with conditions. Chinese infrastructure came with Chinese labor and procurement rules. Iranian agricultural assistance promised much, but the technology required was difficult to scale. For the urban youth who had cheered Traoré's defiance, patience was tested. Pride could not replace paychecks, and speeches could not pave roads. Some began leaving the country, part of a growing brain drain that drained the revolution of its brightest minds. They carried with them not resentment, but resignation, a sense that their dignity remained intact, but their future demanded safer, more prosperous horizons abroad. Still, for many Burkinabe, the hardships were reframed as the price of authenticity. Traore himself insisted that revolutions are never neat, never painless. Breaking chains, he reminded his people, hurts. Building new institutions takes time. If change were easy, others would have done it long ago. This reframing struck a chord across villages and towns. The very difficulty of the struggle became proof that it was real. In speeches, he urged citizens to endure today's wounds for tomorrow's sovereignty. He spoke of ancestors who had resisted colonial conquest, of kingdoms that once stood independent, of dignity that no hardship could erase. His words echoed beyond borders, touching young Africans who began to see their own frustrations mirrored in Burkina Faso's experience. For many across the continent, the question crystallized: could the hardships of Burkina Faso become the seed of something greater? The first proof that an anti-colonial Africa was more than a dream, that dignity could survive the weight of displacement, hunger, and economic strain. This was the paradox. The worse the conditions became, the more some believed the struggle was authentic. But belief does not fill empty stomachs, nor does it guarantee security. And yet, even amid hunger and fear, his people kept asking, is dignity worth the price? No revolution unfolds in isolation. From the moment Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on television declaring a new dawn, the eyes of the world fixed on Burkina Faso. In Western capitals, the response was swift and unambiguous. European officials warned of instability, American diplomats raised alarms about democratic backsliding, and international organizations published reports criticizing restrictions on press freedom and questioning the legitimacy of military rule. Sanctions followed. The European Union imposed targeted measures not only on Burkina Faso, but also on its allies, Mali and Niger. Aid programs were suspended. Foreign investors hesitated, and the message was clear. There would be a cost for stepping outside the established order. Western media amplified the narrative, painting Traoré as another strongman cloaked in revolutionary rhetoric. Headlines spoke of authoritarianism, insecurity, and economic decline, while rarely acknowledging the decades of external interference that had hollowed out democratic institutions in the first place. Yet in much of Africa, the same events were interpreted differently. From Dakar to Nairobi, commentators argued that Western concern was less about democracy and more about the loss of influence. Pan-African conferences became stages where Traoré received ovations for proclaiming independence of thought and action. For young Africans, long disillusioned with leaders who bowed to former colonial powers, the symbolism mattered more than the statistics. Regional institutions like COAs attempted to reassert authority, threatening sanctions and suspension. But their warnings increasingly rang hollow to populations who saw them as echoing Western priorities rather than defending African dignity. The creation of the Alliance of Sahel states was celebrated by many as a genuine attempt at regional integration, untainted by the shadow of external control. For his critics abroad, Traoré's pivot toward Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran was proof of authoritarian alliances. For his supporters, it was something else entirely. They described it as the first step towards African sovereignty, a sovereignty defined not by perfect conditions, but by the willingness to choose partners freely rather than accept relationships dictated by history. The clash of narratives could not be sharper. In Western think tanks, Traoré was a problem to be contained. In African youth circles, he was a voice finally speaking aloud what generations had whispered, that dignity mattered more than approval ratings abroad. But the louder his message carried across continents, the heavier the expectations became at home. And the question loomed, could a single young captain bear the weight of a continent's hope while resisting the world's pressure? Revolutions do not end with declarations. They unfold in the long grind of building what comes next. For Ibrahim Traoré, the path ahead is neither straight nor smooth. It is a road cut through rock, full of bends, shadows, and sudden turns. The opportunities are undeniable. By forcing a break with France and demanding fairer terms from multinational corporations, Traoré has opened the possibility that Burkina Faso might finally keep more of its wealth. Mining contracts are being renegotiated, local processing plants are planned, and agricultural reforms promise to reduce dependence on imported food. If these policies take root, the nation could move beyond the model of raw extraction and step into value-added production, a leap that has eluded so many African economies. Regional cooperation also carries promise. The Alliance of Sahel states offers a framework for joint security and economic planning. If it endures, it could transform a region once dismissed as fragile into a bloc capable of speaking with one voice. In the long term, shared infrastructure projects and pooled resources might create resilience against both militant threats and economic shocks. But the risks are as heavy as the hopes. Militancy remains rampant, displacing millions and threatening the stability of the state. New partnerships with Russia, China, and Iran provide breathing space, but also come with conditions that could replicate dependency in another form. The global isolation triggered by defying Western powers continues to choke investment and limit access to capital markets. And at home, youth unemployment and the exodus of skilled workers cast shadows over the dream of renewal. There is also the weight of expectation. Across Africa, millions now view Traoré not simply as a head of state, but as a symbol of defiance. This symbolism inspires, but it also constrains. A single leader cannot, by himself, deliver the prosperity, security, and dignity that an entire continent demands. Failure in Ouagadougou could be read not only as his failure, but as the failure of a broader movement. Traoré himself has acknowledged this paradox. In speeches, he has argued that building true independence requires patience, sacrifice, and resilience. You cannot build a house while the foundation is shaking, he said, insisting that the transition must last until institutions are strong enough to resist both external pressure and internal weakness. To some, this sounds like pragmatism. To others, it sounds like indefinite rule. The path forward, then, is a contest between time and pressure. Can Burkina Faso survive the short-term storms long enough to harvest the fruits of sovereignty? Can a generation enduring hardship today believe that tomorrow's soil will yield dignity and strength? The soil is ready, but will the harvest ever come? 3 years after a young captain stepped in front of the cameras and declared a nation free, the story of Burkina Faso is still being written. What is clear, however, is that Ibrahim Traoré has already shifted the conversation about Africa's place in the world. He has shown that a continent once spoken for can now speak for itself. The struggle has not been easy. Villages remain displaced, the economy still leans heavily on gold, and militants continue to test the state's defenses. Yet, through hardship, a new spirit has been born. Across the Sahel and beyond, people speak of dignity with renewed conviction. They see in Burkina Faso not perfection, but courage. The courage to stand, to risk, to declare that sovereignty is not granted by others, but claimed by one's own hands. This is why the story matters beyond Ouagadougou. The defiance of one small, landlocked nation has inspired debates in Nairobi, protests in Dakar, and movements in Niamey. It has reminded millions that the dream of an anti-colonial Africa is not buried in the past. It breathes in the present, in every speech that rejects dependency and in every policy that dares to put people before profit. For his critics, Traoré is a dangerous strongman. For his supporters, he is a symbol of renewal. But in either case, he embodies a question larger than himself. Can this generation prove that African sovereignty is more than a slogan, that it can be lived, built, and defended despite the storms? If he succeeds, the path he clears may open a chapter that stretches across the continent, one where dignity is not negotiable and freedom is not deferred. If he fails, the skeptics will call it proof that Africa cannot govern itself without masters. That is why the stakes are so high, and why the soil of Burkina Faso carries the weight of so many dreams. The world is watching. If one small landlocked nation can dare, what stops the rest? Stay with this story. Subscribe, share, and comment, because the voice of an anti-colonial Africa is rising, and you are part of it.